A lot of visual novel game devs tend to jump right into making their first game before they even really read a visual novel, which is fine, but it means missing out on the wealth of hard-fought lessons and genre conventions behind the 40-year history of visual novels. So let's look at just 100 words and terms that can give you a jumpstart on your visual novel dev education. And let's start with a weird fact. The term visual novel is a brand name. In Japan, many visual novels are considered novel games, or NVL, but more often than not, they get looped into the larger term of adventure games, often shortened as ADV. One of the earliest games considered to be a visual novel was the Portopia serial murder case. When the company Leaf decided to make the novel game Shizuku, they created a brand term for their novel games: visual novels. Leaf's games ended up becoming so influential that when they were localized in the West, we ended up using the term visual novel for anything that fits those vibes. Kinetic novels are another in-house genre name from the publishing company Visual Arts, but their visual novels don't give the player any choices, story branching, or multiple endings, just one narrative. This game style was consistent enough to end up becoming a term that's used for any visual novel with no choices. Chunsoft has its own in-house genre name, sound novel, but it hasn't really taken off as a visual novel term. While these are all narrative games made by big companies, doujinshi refer to books, manga, and games created by self-publishers. The game company Type Moon released their visual novel Tsukihime as a doujin, but later found success commercially with Fate Stay Night. Japan popularized visual novels, but when Western indie game developers started making their own, fans wanted a term to separate the English-made visual novels apart from their Japanese counterparts. OELVN, or Original English Language Visual Novel, was one of the first forerunners for this term, but eventually we settled into EVN for English visual novel, JVN for Japanese visual novel, and visual novels have been crazy popular in Russia, so now we have RVN for Russian visual novels. Japan considers a lot more games to be novel games, but in the West, visual novel fans tend to be a little restrictive about what gets classified as a visual novel. Most fall into three categories. If a game includes a lot of visual novel elements in the story presentation, but it's mostly a different game type altogether, like a JRPG or a puzzle game, we generally call that a hybrid visual novel. If a visual novel keeps track of some element of gameplay, like items you collect and use, or stat increases that you gain over time, it would be considered a stat raiser, or SLG, a simulation game. Dating sims could be considered a type of stat raiser, but they can vary a lot in terms of complexity. You could have to do some stat raising and juggling your schedule to get your romantic partner of choice, or just say the right thing at the right time during the story. We'll go into stuff like genre later, but for now, let's focus on the actual components that make a visual novel. Some standard visual novel features are the skip button, which lets you fast forward the story until you reach a choice menu, or a part of the game you haven't read before. The history or backlog button lets you read through parts of the story you've already read. Sometimes it can just be what you've read in this playthrough, or sometimes there are more complicated ways of displaying the many different story branches, like the Automatic Diverge Mapping System, or ADMS, which was one of the earlier attempts to show branching storylines, but lots of games have different methods to show this nowadays. Normally, you need to press a button to move the text and story forward, but autoplay will automatically advance the next line of text at a steady pace, which makes the visual novel play more like an anime. As the story advances, you'll see CGs, unique pieces of art used only in one part of the story, or cutscenes, which are animated parts of the story, usually with voice acting. To let users see them again, there will be a gallery to see all the CGs, a replay gallery to show the cutscenes, and a jukebox to hear all of the game's music. Let's look at a screenshot of a visual novel and break up the different parts you see on screen. Art-wise, anything that helps the player interact with the game is called the user experience, or UX. This includes the controller, the display screen, what's on the screen, all of that. The graphic user interface, GUI, or UI for short, is specifically the part of the UX that relates to on-screen graphics. If you look at a classic visual novel screen, the way the text is displayed is also part of the GUI and come in a few flavors. Text displayed in a text box, usually with sprites behind the background, are called ADV style after classic adventure games, while games where the text is displayed full screen, usually with some graphics behind it, is called NVL style after novel games. The actual text inside is made of dialogue and narration, which are usually displayed differently. Dialogue usually gets some way to refer to what character is saying the dialogue with a name display or a small picture, while the narration generally gets displayed minimally to show no one in particular is saying it. Since the narration generally gets coded the same as a character, we refer to the distinct character saying the narration as the narrator. Often, visual novels are made with the intention of characters facing you, so the off-screen player character is often referred to as the main character, or MC. Besides the UI, a sprite is any graphical presentation of a character that is separated from the background, or BG for short, which is some sort of pattern or environment the sprites are displayed on. If there's some other effects on the screen, like a sword slice or punch, anything that just gears there with a little animation, we call those visual effects, or VFX for short. Visual novels also have sound, and there are a lot of different terms and designations for the various types of audio that we use in games. Many of the characters in visual novels get audio for their spoken lines, which we refer to as voiceover, or VO. It doesn't have to be every line, and some games will utilize something called barks, or sound bites. Barks are short pieces of dialogue or onomatopoeias that inform the player about something. So in visual novels, usually we'll want to inform the players about a character's intentionality. Instead of saying the whole line, "I hate you," with a particular inflection, a character might give off a or an "ah," or an "ugh." An experienced voice actor, or VA for short, is the person who says these voice lines. And your choice in voice actor and the voice actor's various choices can also inform a lot about the character in your game by their general voice quality. The music that plays during the game is called the background music, or BGM for short. If the background music is something that the characters in the story can hear themselves, so the music comes from a music box or something playing on the radio, that's referred to as diegetic sound. But if the characters aren't supposed to hear the background music, like when the boss battle music plays, that would be something called non-diegetic music. If the music changes based on players' input in the story, like suddenly it gets louder and scarier when you press a dialogue option, that's called adaptive music, but it can also be referred to as dynamic music or interactive music. If you have sounds that activate during a playthrough that are not part of the music track, those are called sound effects, or SFX. So those are the various parts of the game that you can see and hear, but let's go into some game production specific terms, the stuff that happens before the game even reaches stores. If you're making a game, you're called a dev, short for developer. But generally people use the term to refer to programmers specifically, the team members who write code. And code is when you create and define functionality in your program. The program is the thing that actually runs your game on someone's computer. Writing code is also called scripting. Now you'd think that's all you need to know, but there's actually like a few stages in the game making process. Pre-production covers everything you do before actually making the game. Market research, concept sketches, drafts, outlines, planning, and scheduling are all things you generally want to do before you enter actual production. At this stage, you also want to settle on your game engine, which is specialized software that offers tools and features to build games efficiently. A prototype is a build where you're testing the viability of these base features of the game. This can range anywhere from something you can play on pen and paper, all the way to an early playable version of the game. Sometimes you'll be testing out the gameplay mechanics, which are the elements that guide the player's actions, or you want to test some discrete part of your system, like a new graphics shader. Not every game needs a prototype, but when you have the chance to make them, they're pretty good. You should make some prototypes. Another kind of prototype is a vertical slice, which is a finished looking short segment of your game. A vertical slice is usually a proof of concept you want to show to potential investors or publishers, and will need a development cycle of its own. When you have all this planning together, you'll want to compile it in a GDD, or game design document, that lays out your story, gameplay, characters, and design. Generally, you want one copy to be a living document, which means it's going to be actively updated by your team over time as your game changes in scope and direction. Production is the actual process of making a game, and we break this up into a few milestones, which we call builds. Builds are when you've reached a point in development where the game is ready for implementation, and you can start playing and testing it. An alpha build is a build of the game where you're ready to test the functionality of the base game. So not everything is in the game, but you have the most important systems and you can start testing them for bugs, which are things that make a game break, create complications, or just make it less fun. Removing bugs from your game is called debugging. A beta build is where the game is feature complete and has most of the base graphics, but you might still need more content. This is the stage where you want to make sure you iron out as many bugs as possible, and you generally don't want to add any new systems or gameplay mechanics. Adding too much new content over time can be considered scope creep or feature creep, which is when developers add more stuff to their game than they originally planned. A release candidate, or RC, is the final version of the game before it goes through a final testing phase. Each of these testing processes at the prototype, alpha, beta, and RC stages is part of the QA, or quality assurance process. You want playtesters, who are people that test your game to check for bugs, see if your game is enjoyable, or help balance gameplay. You can get friends and family to do this, but usually you want QA testers, who are professionals who do this for a living. And they usually have enough programming knowledge to not only spot the bugs, but have a pretty good idea of how to fix them. When your game finally has all of its assets and features, passes the final QA stage, we call this the Gold Master. And if a game gets shipped to different countries, you'll need it translated. A translator is the person who will actually translate the text into one language to another, but it's easy to forget that other things need to be changed too, which is where you want localizers. Team members who identify the dialogue, assets, and other content that need to be translated for new languages or regions. Usually you'll see this with idioms and cultural references that need to be translated with a bit more care, but they also make sure iconography is something that can be identified in each region. Anything that goes into a game, art, sound, UI, even some discrete parts of your code, are called assets. Music, VO, and sound effects can be expensive to produce, so while making a game you can use scratch audio, which is temporary audio that you use until you get the final tracks. Art can also be expensive, so you can also use temp assets, which is a generic term for anything, art, music, or sound, that you're just going to use until you can get final assets. With visual temp assets, you'll usually hear it referred to as white boxing or gray boxing, because you can just use boxes as visual placeholders. Anything that you've created has a copyright, which means it's your protected intellectual property. You can apply to get your work registered for a copyright, but at an indie level, just don't bother. If someone else made something for you, then you want to make sure you either own the copyright as well, or you want to license the work, which means the creator still has the copyright, but they're letting you use the work. If you're using anything pre-made, you want to make sure you buy the license, or that the product is royalty-free, which is to say it can be bought and used without paying further money for its continued use. If you're lucky, you can find assets that use Creative Commons, which means it can be used under certain specific conditions. Commonly that the work you use has to be attributed to the original creator, or it can't be remixed or changed. In some cases, you can get the assets in the public domain, which are works that either the copyright owner has given up their claim to, or it's old enough that the copyright protections have run out. Now, those are a lot of developer-specific terms, but when it comes to visual novel story mechanics, that's something we can all enjoy. Most visual novels have choices in them, which is when the game presents the player with multiple pickable options. Now, choices don't always have to be consequential. Sometimes you just want to present choices to the player to keep them engaged, or you're using choices as some level of game customization. But consequential choices often lead to different story branches, which is when player choices result in the narrative diverging in different directions. Consequential choices that do this are usually referred to as flags, which is a programming term for when a variable in a game is changed. Consequential choices are usually pretty easy for players to suss out based on the distinct branches they create, and a route is defined by story branches that diverge enough to create different distinct narrative paths. Routes and story branches often come in a few easy to spot forms. Ever-branching is when the story just keeps branching out until it reaches different endings. This is the type of branching that first-time devs tend to make, but it's incredibly time-intensive to actually write all these things. Branch and bottleneck is when you branch out a lot but rejoin the central narrative line. This can make choices seem less impactful long-term, but it's great for an anthology narrative structure. String of pearls is when there's a main narrative through line, but there are branches that come off of it and either end the story early or rejoin the central narrative path. Finally, a non-linear story is when the different story branches can be taken in any order, or be skipped and ignored entirely. This works great if your story is connected to places the player actually needs to explore and go to, as opposed to linear events in a timeline. When you're constructing a story, you'll often use a lot of these different narrative branch structures, but at different granularities. And once you mix them with flags, or maybe even stat systems, you can create a lot of narrative complexity. For instance, an enforced playing order is when a visual novel requires you to get to a specific ending or route before it will allow you to access another ending or route. An episodic story is one where the game is arranged into a bunch of self-contained narratives with distinct beginning, middle, and ends. An anthology story is one where the visual novel is a collection of unconnected short stories. Because of all these different branching story structures that create a lot of ending branch points, there's a lot of different types of endings that visual novels tend to have to cap off each one of those routes. A good end is an ending where the protagonist wins, achieves their goals, or ends up better than when they started. While a bad end is an ending where the protagonist loses, fails at their goals, or ends up worse than they started. A bad end is different from a game over, which is when the game ends abruptly without a satisfying narrative end. These are usually punishments for player failure with the intention that the player will try to play the game again, but some visual novels will turn them into joke endings, where the reality of the game's narrative gets broken for a gag. This can take the form of fourth wall breaks, characters acting silly, or anything else that the player should not treat seriously. A true end is the ending that's considered to be the most true to the intentions of the author, and is usually the canonical ending reflected if the visual novel continues in sequels or other media. It's usually the good ending, but it could also be a bad ending. So imagine you read a lot of visual novels and someone just casually asks you to categorize them in some way. A more academic way to categorize them would be to break them up into literary genres and subdivide them further based on their themes and settings. But a more fun way to categorize them is to go, that one's great, that one's sad, that one's got cute girls, that one sucks. And that's the labeling system that has stuck. A karage is a visual novel that is more focused on characters and player interactions with them, while a plot-ge is more focused on the twists and turns of an ongoing narrative. A more specific example of a karage would be something like a moe-ge, where the focus is on spending time with cute girls, while a more specific plot-ge would be something like a chuni-ge, which is named after the type of game cringy middle school kids would love. Melodramatic action schlock with a focus on over-the-top set pieces and edgy plot devices. A more useful label is something like a fan disc, also known as side stories, which are games that are produced as a, quote, gift to fans to supplement a previous visual novel. These were originally produced as standalone products, but nowadays they're more likely to be DLC add-ons. This is what a publisher rushes out so they can capitalize on the success of a popular game, but with less effort than a full-blown sequel. And then these labels are helpful for general, visual novel vibes. Nakige are visual novels that are sad and make you cry, but usually have a happy ending, while Utsuge are visual novels that are depressing, draining, and usually have unhappy endings. Kamige are top-tier visual novels where even if you're not a fan of the particular genre, are considered so good you should play them anyway. You should recommend Kamige to your friends. Meanwhile, Kusage are terrible games. Broken builds, bad story, horrible music, terrible gameplay. You should warn your friends about Kusage. And finally, we have tons of labels to describe the smorgasbord of romance games visual novels have to offer. Renai is a term for romance dating sims. Honestly, this was never a popular term, but this is where the name Renpai originally came from, combining Renai with Python, so it's historically significant. Ichaicha, or Rabu Rabu, or Lovey Lovey games are visual novels where you see couples flirt and kiss and be affectionate together, while eroge, or erotic games, are usually where the couples do a little bit more than that for an 18 or older mature audience. There are a lot of other subgenres of eroge, but I don't want this video to be demonetized, so we won't cover any of those. But the vast majority of visual novels focus on the romance part before all that, and they come in a lot of other subgenres based on the player's preference. Baishoujo, or galge, are games that focus on romancing beautiful women, while baishonen are games that focus on romancing boys. These were traditionally pretty heteronormative, but baishonen as a genre found itself embraced by the queer community as a whole and evolved into a few new forms. GL, or girls' love, is used pretty interchangeably with yuri and focus on intimate relationships between women. BL, or boys love, are about intimate relationships between men, but while yaoi is usually created by women for other women, bara is an umbrella term used for gay male love stories created by men for other men. Otome, or otoge, are romance games where the intended audience is for women, regardless of the actual romanceable character options. In the West, the term amare was coined for visual novels with an otome vibe, but without any real strict gender definitions, but generally, people have stuck with the term otome for romance games in general. So right now you might be thinking, I counted every single one of those terms and that was over 100. Okay, you caught me, but good visual novel game devs need to know even more. And these videos here will show you some useful information you might not know, so check them out.